Well, when Julia Gillard announced a September election, one of the reasons she gave for naming the poll date 8 months out was so the nation could focus on policy, not petty politics. Tonight at 7:30 is going to bring you the first in a series of stories that will run over the next few months, looking at the big policy issues that matter to Australians. We'll explore everything from education to industrial relations. And tonight we're starting with health funding, which already has the federal and state governments at loggerheads. Here's National Affairs correspondent Heather Hewitt.
Belinda Rogers suffers from multiple sclerosis and relies on crutches to get around. She's a single mother on a disability pension in country Victoria. Life was already tough. Then, just before Christmas, she dislocated her shoulder.
I'm struggling. It's compounding the MS badly in terms of my mobility issues. I'm already in a lot of pain with a variety of MS problems. You learn to cope with a certain amount of pain, but it's a bit like that saying, the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it's feeling like that point for me.
Belinda was told she'd have to wait until August to even see a local specialist.
And that's not even getting it fixed, that's just 8 months to see the surgeon. Another 8 months of struggling like this feels really, really daunting.
The simplest thing, like trying to make a cup of coffee, has become an ordeal. How long can you keep this up for?
I don't know how I'm going to do it, to be honest. I really don't. It's hard work, and that's just making a cup of coffee. That's not trying to cook a meal. That's, trying to peel potatoes or chop a carrot at the moment is literally impossible. I can't do it.
Belinda Rogers' surgery was classified as elective. That meant she'd go on a waiting list at the nearby West Gippsland Hospital, with all the rest of the locals who can't afford private health insurance.
Why such a long wait?
Because our local hospital has been impacted by the closures of operating theatres and bed closures because of the constant toing and froing and blame game between the federal government and state government over the funding issue.
It was all supposed to be so different when Labor came to power.
My commitment to the Australian people, if elected, is to end the blame game between Canberra and the states when it comes to health and hospitals.
But 5 years on, the blame game continues.
There has never been more Commonwealth money flowing into the Victorian system, and yet waiting lists have never been longer. I think you really have to ask questions about the management of the Victorian health system.
We're not responding to some semantic sort of blame game. We're responding to a very real cut to hospitals that will impact on Victorian patients.
Every Australian health minister, whether it be Labor, LNP or Coalition, has been protesting this.
They're protesting all right. In Queensland, health workers are up in arms at thousands of jobs slashed from the health sector by the state government. And in Victoria, they're rallying against the combination of cuts by state and federal governments as public hospital waiting lists grow and more than 400 beds close. As usual, the sticking point is over who's at fault.
In the end, the government has cut $1.6 billion from their federal commitment, and patients are going to suffer now and over the next 3 or 4 years.
But the federal government tells its critics all it's done is trim what was already a big growth in funding.
I can tell you, Heather, no health minister likes to see their funding growing more slowly than they hope. But in essence, that's what's happening here.
It's true that health funding overall is still going up, just not as much as the federal and state governments had settled on in the National Health Agreement last year. Under the formula, each state gets a fixed amount in line with inflation and population growth. Now the federal government has decided to take back $1.6 billion. That's because it now says the forecast population growth was overestimated.
What's caused this problem is the Bureau of Statistics has changed the way it measures growth in population. And so at the start of the year, all the states were expecting a certain amount of money based on growth in population. Right now, what's happened is for some states, the Bureau has reduced the recorded population, and so the funding reduces.
The change was announced last October, 4 months into the financial year. It hit the three most populated states the hardest. In New South Wales, the cut was $139 million this year and a total of $641 million over the next 4 years. Victoria will lose $475 million all up, and Queensland will lose $382. That's from a total funding pool of $72 billion.
The hospitals and the community services in the public sector receive that cut directly. In this case, they had already planned their services for this financial year, 2012-13. They'd allocated their budgets and, hey presto, the Commonwealth Treasury makes a cut.
In some states, the cuts were absorbed by state governments, but in Victoria, they were immediately passed on to public hospitals, and all have either cut staff or closed beds and deferred elective surgery. At Melbourne's Austin Hospital, it means 800 fewer operations for the rest of the financial year to deal with a $6.7 million cut in its funding allocation.
There are always adjustments to Commonwealth state funding, I understand, and they happen every year, but I think the size of this as passed on to the health services has been quite difficult to cope with because it was so quick. You know, we only had a few weeks to adapt to it in the middle of a financial year.
The state health ministers in other states are managing this completely differently to the way the Victorian Health Minister is managing it. The Victorian Health Minister has just said to local hospital CEOs, you're on your own, do your worst. And no other state is handling it in that way.
I did not seek this cut. I did not request the federal government initiate this unscheduled and unprecedented cut.
The federal government claims there's money available to Victoria it's not using. And the state government has made its own cuts, slashing $616 million from health spending. But it argues this is somehow different to the federal cut.
Well, the federal governments are not savings measures. They're just straight cuts. Our savings measures have been reinvested in services.
They've made massive cuts of their own, and it is a bit rich for them to be looking around for someone to blame for that at the moment.
It's very hard to determine who's right and who's wrong in an absolute sense.
They're both wrong. They're both acting like little kids in this blame game. They're both standing on their dignity, and they're both right. That is, the Commonwealth is saying, you know, we're just following orders. The Bureau of Statistics said this is what your population is and this is what we're going to fund you on, and the states are saying, well, hang on, you don't implement budget cuts in the middle of a financial year.
While the Coalition says it wouldn't have made the cuts, it's yet to outline its health policy in this election year.
I'm excited about what we've got to offer at the next election, and we'll make an announcement closer to the next election.
Little wonder that patients are confused, frustrated and bracing themselves for more of the same as the election campaign unfolds. The Australian Patients Association says it's been flooded with complaints.
People are in pain. They're disappointed with politicians who, year after year, have the same arguments about hospital funding and can't seem to get an answer for patients.
As for Belinda Rogers, she does now have an answer of sorts. Late last week, her surgeon recognised her plight, and her local hospital is now trying to schedule her surgery within the next 3 months. Belinda's health continues to deteriorate.
What started off as a fairly simple tendon tear, which would be fairly simply fixed, has now developed into a worse injury. And if I fall again, the injury will worsen again. And instead of being just a simple tendon tear, I could be facing a full shoulder reconstruction. It's crazy.
And as I mentioned, we'll have more of those special reports looking at key policy areas in the lead up to the September election.